So last week we looked at the strengths and weaknesses of the Patriots and the British. We also looked at some of the early battles of the American Revolution. We talked about the First and Second Continental Congresses, and we also talked about Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. And we wrapped up the week by talking about the Declaration of Independence. Now, one of your assignments this week will be to write another diary entry based on the Declaration of Independence and what your character would have felt after the Declaration of Independence. So one idea for that might be, if you are the Patriot soldier, how do you feel now that you are fighting to be part of your own country? You're fighting against the British to be an American, to be able to have your own country. If you're the wife of a Patriot soldier, how do you feel now that America has officially declared its independence? Are you excited for that? Are you more worried than ever for your husband? Because now he is potentially going to be gone for a long period of time. If you are the Patriot spy, if you're the woman spy for George Washington, now that you are spying and there's this kind of Declaration of Independence where the Americans are saying we don't even want to be part of Britain anymore, are you more concerned for your safety? Are you excited because of the fact that you are spying for a cause that could lead to your freedom? So what are your thoughts? And finally, if you're the British soldier, when you hear this Declaration of Independence, are you frustrated because now you're going to have to be part of a war away from your family, thousands of miles across the ocean, for even longer, knowing that it'll probably be years before you can go home? So those are the types of things that you're going to want to write for your diary entry number 3, which is the Declaration of Independence. And so you can do that after you finish watching this PowerPoint and take the quiz. Today we will move on to talk about some of the other battles. In fact, we'll talk about 3 battles in particular today, and then we'll kind of we'll wrap up and kind of finish talking about the American Revolution, the American Revolutionary War. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the winter of 1776, 1777, and then 1777-78 at a place called Valley Forge. The Continental Army had been soundly defeated in 1776 at New York, and they were in big trouble. Many of the people who had signed up, their enlistments were up at the end of the year, and they were planning on going home. And George Washington set up his men at Valley Forge to try to get through the winter. Many soldiers were about to quit, as I just mentioned, at the end of 1776, and George Washington needed to produce a victory. If he didn't get some sort of victory or something to get the soldiers excited by the end of 1776, the revolution would have been over. The war would have been over, and as a result, the revolution would have been over as well. And so George Washington was always a great military tactician and a great leader, and he came up with an idea. He decided that he was going to attack on Christmas night, or really the morning after Christmas. Typically in the wintertime, armies back then would not really have battles because the roads became very muddy and icy and snowy and just hard to travel. And so most of the time, the armies that were fighting each other would pretty much go into their shelters and just kind of hang out for the winter and stay warm and continue to have drills and practice, but they wouldn't really have battles in the winter. And George Washington decided he was going to try to take advantage of this. And so on Christmas night of 1776, George Washington's troops crossed over the Delaware River from Valley Forge, which is outside of Philadelphia, in the snow. It was a full-out nor'easter storm. They crossed over the Delaware River in the snow and marched on Trenton and surprised the Hessian troops that were stationed there. Now, let's quickly define a few things. The Hessian soldiers were mercenaries that were fighting for the British. So mercenaries were hired soldiers that were paid simply to fight. And these Hessian soldiers were stationed at Trenton, New Jersey, and George Washington's men crossed over the Delaware River in the middle of the night, in the middle of a snowstorm, and they marched 8 miles to Trenton, where as the sun was coming up that morning, December 26th, they surprised the Hessians and were able to defeat them soundly. The Americans won the battle easily, and they took over 900 prisoners. And the victory was so important because it helped to keep General Washington's army from quitting when, in the first of the year, when their terms were up. One of the other things I would like to mention about the Battle of Trenton is as the soldiers were walking the 8 miles down the road to Trenton that evening, as they were walking down the road, the snow that covered the roads was stained red. And the reason why it was stained red is because many of the soldiers did not have shoes and their feet were bleeding as they walked. And when the Americans won this victory over the Hessian soldiers, many of the American soldiers simply took shoes from the bodies of those who had been killed and from the prisoners, took their shoes so that they would have shoes to wear, along with other supplies that were needed like coats and blankets, and of course food and ammunition. So the Battle of Trenton was a huge victory for George Washington, because if the Americans would not have won this battle, the Revolution would have been over. The next battle that we're going to talk about is what we call the turning point of the American Revolution. The battle at Saratoga was the turning point of the war. Up to this point, most of the momentum had been on the side of the British, but after the Battle of Saratoga, the momentum begins to shift towards the Americans. So it's in 1777, so the next year after the Battle of Trenton, and here's what happens. The British general Burgoyne decides he wanted to march his troops across New York and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, basically cut the colonies in half. Well, uh, General Burgoyne didn't take roads. He was trying to basically cut across the woods, and the British had hundreds and hundreds of wagons full of supplies. And as they got into the woods, they became bogged down, and the Americans used their guerrilla warfare tactics that they had been using at different places like Lexington and Concord to constantly be attacking Burgoyne's soldiers and then running away quickly. And these guerrilla warfare tactics worked splendidly. Eventually, General Burgoyne ends up surrendering at Saratoga, and the momentum of the war is changed. That's why this is known as the turning point of the war. Because of the American victory, and this is another really super important part about the Battle of Saratoga, because of the American victory at Saratoga, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch all join in the fight for independence. So now the Americans are getting help from other countries. The French, the most help came from the French, but they also got help from the Spanish and the Dutch as well. So that's 1777. The war drags on for another 4 or 5 years, 4 years or so. And in 1781, the decisive victory would come. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But once the foreign aid comes, here's how it comes. Number one, France and Spain are the two biggest contributors. And here's what they contribute. They provided military supplies, and they provided soldiers as well. The French provide a man specifically named the Marquis de Lafayette, and you can see him on the left here in the picture. The Marquis de Lafayette was a young soldier who really admired George Washington and wanted to kind of emulate him and fight with him. And the Marquis de Lafayette, he served in the Continental Army. He donated his own money to the cause, and he even persuaded the French king to send more aid to the Americans. The help also came from a man named Baron Friedrich von Steuben. And von Steuben was from a place called Prussia, which is kind of near where Germany is today. And von Steuben was so important to the Americans because in that brutal winter of 1776 and then 1777, von Steuben taught the colonists, or the Americans, how to be soldiers. Remember, the Americans that were fighting were mainly farmers and craftsmen. They really didn't know how to fight, whereas the British soldiers had been gone to school to be soldiers since the time they were 8 or 9 or 10 years old. But the Americans, they weren't soldiers at all. And so this military training that von Steuben provided was crucial to the Americans eventually winning the war. Well, let's get back to the battles. The final decisive battle of the Revolution, and the one that the Americans were able to really kind of capitalize on, is the Battle of Yorktown. And the Battle of Yorktown was another example, just like at Dorchester Heights, of George Washington outfoxing the British. And here's how it went. Washington's men were all up in Brooklyn, New York, surrounding Brooklyn, New York, and most of his men were there. A small amount of men were in some other places, but most of the men were in Brooklyn, New York. And Washington gets word that General Cornwallis, the British general, has put himself at Yorktown, Virginia. And Washington comes up with a plan to outfox the British. And he knows that if he can surround Cornwallis, if you look at the map here, you can see that Yorktown was up against the York River. And he knows that if he can surround Cornwallis's men and cut off his escape by the river, he would have Cornwallis. And so Washington decides to plan this attack. He has to march his men nearly 400 miles overland to get to Yorktown. But he doesn't want the British to know he's doing it, because if they know, they can be ready for the attack. And so what Washington does is, one night, as his men are surrounding Brooklyn, New York, he leaves several hundred men behind, and those men basically create huge bonfires and go around the whole encampment and to make it look like the camp is still there. Meanwhile, Washington's main force quietly walk off in the night and begin marching south towards Yorktown, Virginia. And they march as fast as they can to Yorktown, Virginia, and several weeks later they arrive. And you may say to yourself, well, if it's several weeks later, why didn't the British know they were coming? Well, the British didn't realize that George Washington's men had left Brooklyn until several days later, which gave the Americans the head start to be able to march to Yorktown. When they get to Yorktown, they surround the town, as you can see on the map, and they relied on the French fleet to come up the York River and block the water escape. And when they do this, they end up surrounding Cornwallis, who's forced to surrender. So you can see from the notes here, British General Cornwallis had stationed his men at Yorktown to stay close to the British fleet. Washington had the British convinced he was going to attack New York, while he secretly left New York with his army and marched to Yorktown, Virginia. The combined forces of Americans and French Navy surrounded Cornwallis and forced him to surrender his 8,000 men. This huge victory was basically the end of the war. Now, this is the year 1781. The official peace treaty doesn't happen for 2 more years until 1783, but essentially the war is over after the Battle of Yorktown. The British lose their will to fight. They're no longer willing to fight, and the king decides to look for a peace treaty. So that leads us to 1783. The Treaty of Paris is the end of the war. As I just mentioned, the Battle of Yorktown was the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. Britain really the king just didn't want to keep paying money for soldiers to fight in this war. Remember, the king had been paying money during the French and Indian War back in the 1750s, and now he's paying money again for the last 15 years or so to pay soldiers that are fighting against the Americans. And the king just had had enough. So the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783. This officially recognizes the independence of the United States. So what you want to do at this point is go ahead and take the quiz that goes with this PowerPoint presentation video. Once you're done with the quiz, you can go ahead and do diary entry number 3, which is the Declaration of Independence. You can also do diary entry number 4 and number 5, which should be with your which should be in this week's folder as well. Diary entry number 4 was the Battle of Trenton. Remember, that's where George Washington's soldiers, in the middle of the night, on Christmas night, surprised the British. Okay, the Battle of Trenton. So diary entry number 4 would be about the Battle of Trenton. And again, how are you feeling if you're a soldier, the Patriot soldier, and you just win this amazing victory? Are you going to renew your enlistment and stay with the Army now that you've won this great victory? If you're the wife of the Patriot soldier, are you excited for this victory because you hope that soon your husband might be able to come home? If you are the spy, are you excited because you hope the war will be over soon and your danger will be over? Or maybe you gave information to George Washington to help with the Battle of Trenton. Maybe you gave him information as to where the Hessians were or something like that. You could do that perspective. And if you're the British soldier, do you just kind of say, oh, those Hessian soldiers, they're mercenaries. If we were there, we wouldn't have let this happen? Or what kind of emotions are going through your head if you're the British soldier? And then you'll do diary entry number 5, which is the final battle at Yorktown. So you want to go ahead and for the Battle of Yorktown, all of those same things for each character. Are you excited? Clearly you're excited. If you're the American soldier, the Patriot soldier, you got to be excited because you know the war is basically over. If you're the wife of the Patriot soldier, you're just praying your husband's still alive and that he'll be coming home soon. If you're the spy, you're praying that the war will officially be over soon so you don't have to be afraid as a spy. And if you're the British soldier, how do you feel right now after the Battle of Yorktown? You know that basically the war is lost and you've been over here wasting the last few years of your life away from your family fighting, and now this cause, the the Americans are going to win their freedom. So those are kind of this perspective you want to write from. So you're going to have your 3 diary entries from this video information. So you'll have diary entry number 3 will be the Declaration of Independence. Diary entry number 4 will be the Battle of Trenton and keeping the revolution alive, and diary entry number 5 will be the Battle of Yorktown and the war now officially being over.